Hello, friends, and welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. My name is Scott Cowan, and I'm the host of the show. Each episode, I have a conversation with an interesting guest who is living in or from Washington State. These are casual conversations with real and interesting people. I think you're going to like the show. So let's jump right in with today's guest. All right, I'm recording this in the afternoon, so I'm sitting here this afternoon with Eric Vickery. Eric is an author, and we're going to talk about his latest book, Season of Shattered Dreams. There's a whole lot more to that title, but we're just going to call it Season of Shattered Dreams. But it's about the 1946 Spokane Indians and a tragic bus crash that happened. Eric, thanks for sitting down with me. And
thanks for having me.
What I want to start with is, what I know about you is this, is you did not grow up in Washington State. You're currently living here now. And your first book was about the St. Louis Cardinals, which I could harass you and tease you like, why? But that's kind of the area you grew up in, right? The Midwest. And were you a Cardinals fan as a kid?
Yes, I was. Yeah, I grew up in Alton, Illinois, which is like 20 miles from St. Louis. Okay. And so that makes perfect sense that you would want to write about the hometown team. Mm-hmm. Your bio also says you're a lifetime baseball fan. I am as well. And I got introduced to baseball through my grandfather, who pitched semi-pro in the 20s and maybe the early 30s in the Seattle area. Okay. And he took me to what my earliest memory, what I remember is he took me to a Tacoma Twins game, which would have been like 70 or 71. And I just remember him telling me that I needed to pay more attention or I was going to get hit by a foul ball. That's the thing I remember. Okay. I don't really remember anything else about the game. I just remember him kind of in his curmudgeonly way telling me to pay attention. And I think it was because I wasn't appreciating the game. I was 10 years old. I was, okay. But baseball's been a thing in my life forever. I also, my junior high history teacher pitched in the major leagues. He pitched briefly for the San Francisco Giants, pitched for the Tacoma Giants as well. His name was John Pergenzer. Okay. And I remember as a middle schooler thinking that this man was huge, and he just recently passed away. But when I saw him as an adult, I realized that, he wasn't a very large, he was tall, but I'm a much bigger human being than I was when I was in middle school. So baseball's been around my world, never written about it. So how'd you get introduced to baseball, and what made you decide to write about baseball? Sure. Well, my baseball fandom goes back to a very early age. I went to my first game in 1986. I remember it very vividly.
Did your grandfather tell you to sit down?
Well, we were up in the nosebleeds, so we didn't have to worry about a foul ball coming up there. Okay. This was at the old Busch Stadium in St. Louis. Okay. Bob Forsch pitched that day. He was the starting pitcher, and he also hit a grand slam. Oh, wow. Okay. So pretty memorable just from that alone. Right. And that same year, I started collecting baseball cards, kind of fell in love with collecting those, and then started listening to games on the radio. Okay. Back then, there weren't a whole lot of games on TV, and then started playing the game too, all around the same time. So it's always just been a huge part of my life. And of course, the St. Louis Cardinals being my hometown team, that was my first love. Mm-hmm. And that was more or less, I've always just been a fan. And since moving out here, I've also jumped on the Mariners bandwagon, but had never written about the game up until 2020 during the pandemic. I think I was just kind of bored and looking for something to pass the time. And I tend to go down rabbit holes on Baseball Reference, which is like the online baseball encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that there were biographies for some players on the website, and that linked me to the SABR website, Society for American Baseball Research. And then I found out that you could write bios for these players. So I signed up and kind of fell in love with the process. So what was your first bio that you wrote? First bio. So I was a little timid, and I didn't want to tackle a big player and have that responsibility. So I picked a guy who played one single game for the St. Louis Cardinals back in 1959.
He was a pitcher, pitched one game, and his name has escaped me.
That's okay. But see, almost to me, that almost seems more daunting in the sense that if you picked, and we're going to talk about Alvin Davis, we'll just mention Alvin Davis because one of the articles you wrote was Alvin Davis.
Yeah.
You know, Alvin, not that Alvin was a superstar baseball player, but he certainly was a hometown fan here in
Sure.
Washington. There's a lot of information about Alvin Davis, but to pick somebody who only played one game, how'd you go? That had to be some digging.
Yeah. So I found out that you can find old editions of the Sporting News online and newspapers through newspapers.com. So by putting in somebody's name and a range of dates, you can find out quite a bit. So the guy I tackled, just played in that one game, had of course a minor league career as well, but there was a lot less information to distill into a few thousand words than say Alvin Davis, who played at the majors for like 10 years. And so there's a lot more information at my disposal. So in some ways, I think tackling a player like Alvin Davis, certainly as a writer, is a little more complicated because there's just a lot more information out there, and you want to try to distill it down to the most important.
Right. Yeah, I still think I would have picked not necessarily Alvin per se, but I would have picked a journeyman player because I would have thought the process would have been easier for research. I see your point though. So you started writing for SABR, and for the audience that doesn't know what SABR really is, it's Society of American Baseball Research. It's been around for 60 years or so. If I'm a member, I'm an on and again, off again. I'm a member for 5 years, and I forget, and then I join up again. It's a great, if you're into baseball, it's well, forget free time if you'll fall into it, and you'll be reading all about players that played one game at St. Louis, one game in Seattle. There's a minor league player here that was a barber. There's just all the stories. There's hundreds and thousands of stories that are available to you.
Yeah.
And then the communities, their local, the Pacific Northwest has a chapter. In fact, not that this is relevant for our podcast, but is it this weekend you're speaking?
It was actually this past weekend.
So you just spoke. So you spoke at the SABR, the PNW SABR meeting at the University of Puget Sound to give a talk about your book. So
yes,
there's events like that all across the U.S. They have a convention. I went to the Seattle convention. That was a overwhelming experience many years ago. But it's a pretty fascinating organization and a great way to be involved. Prior to writing, you said COVID and you were bored. What's your professional background? What do you?
So I am a physician assistant. Is my full-time job. So I'm in the medical field. I've worked in emergency medicine and oncology. So totally unrelated.
Yeah.
I have done some medical writing before. I think I do. I've always enjoyed the process of writing.
Okay.
Whether it's like writing for my high school yearbook, for example, or professionally, medical papers. Just enjoy putting words on paper and kind of expressing myself that way. So I guess it was a bit of a natural fit that I kind of stumbled on this opportunity with SABR.
Okay. So your first full book was The Ronin Redbirds. It's about the 82 champion, the year, the 1982 that they won the championship. That was 4 years before you went to a baseball game though. So
that's right.
So this was you looking back, even predating your involvement with, being a fandom.
Right.
So when you wrote this, were you living in the Midwest or had you moved out here?
Yeah, I was living out here.
You were living out here. Okay.
Okay. And I had written a couple of bios for like Willie McGee and Tom Herr.
Okay.
So those were some of my favorite players growing up, like in the mid to late 80s.
Okay.
But they were also key members of the 82 team. So in some ways, I felt like I knew the team, but I didn't know the story of how that season unfolded. So it was fun to go back and really dig into that.
From a research standpoint, that would have been, I don't want to say easy, I don't mean it like that, but like you said, newspapers, newspaper.com, research material was readily archived from that period of time versus going back. You might, and we'll touch on that in a little bit, I'm sure, but the Spokane story might have been a little bit more spotty in the coverage
No doubt. Yeah.
Okay. So you wrote your first book. Perfect. It went perfectly. There was no hardships. You found a publisher. There was no spell check. Everything was perfect. No. What was it like when you, so walk me through the decision to write a book. Did you think you were going to self-publish? Were you going to look for a publisher? You're married, right?
I am, yes.
And did your partner, your wife, tell you were crazy? What, what was the kind of, what's the backstory here?
Yeah. So first of all, she's always been very supportive of my endeavors,
Okay.
in any realm, in particular my baseball writing, and she's a big baseball fan as well. So
Okay.
I think she gets my love for the game.
And what team does she root for?
So she's very much like me. She grew up in the Midwest,
Okay.
in central Illinois. Her parents were diehard Cardinal fans, so
Okay.
she grew up a Cardinal fan. And like me, she's also on the Mariners bandwagon,
Okay.
and we go to a bunch of games.
So
every year,
it's not like she's a Cubs fan and you have that tension at the household.
No, and I'm not sure we'd be married if that were the case.
I've been to Wrigley twice to see the Cubs play. Both games were against the Cardinals. I think I know what it's like to be at a St. Louis home game. It's overwhelming how much the Cardinal fans travel to Chicago and how, I don't want to say there's tension, but there's definitely,
No doubt. There's definitely some tension.
yeah, there's definitely, there's fans. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, I hijacked. So let's go back. Decided to write a book. What was your process?
So first of all, I had written some of these bios that were like 3,000 to 4,000 words.
Okay.
And I'd probably done like a dozen of these over the course of a year.
Oh,
and
okay.
If you add all that up,
Yeah.
That's kind of approaching the equivalent of a book. And I had always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a book. I had no idea what I would write about, whether it be my memoir. Not that my life is that interesting, but I always just kind of had that as a goal in the back of my mind. I think a lot of people do. So once I had this experience writing with Sabre under my belt and had written all these bios, it seemed much more practical to do this. And then it was just a matter of landing on a topic, and there really hadn't been a full book on the 82 season. So that was my team growing up. So I figured it would be relative, not easy, but easier since I have some familiarity with the team and the players. Right. And I had already done some of the research for a few of the players. So that was kind of where I jumped in, and it took me about a year to write that book.
Okay. And from the publishing standpoint, did you shop it after the manuscript was done, or did you have, how did we get it to market? Yeah.
So that's a great question, because, and this, I've learned a ton about the publishing process, because I went into this totally blind. I think if I would have reached out to publishers before I had written the book, not having any sort of platform or name recognition, it would have been very difficult for me to get like a publishing contract. So I actually wrote the book, and then started reaching out to publishers and agents. And I had in the back of my mind that my backup plan, if all else fails, nowadays you can self-publish relatively easily, and that would be a acceptable option if need be.
Right. Yeah, things have really changed. You can self-publish, print on demand the book if you want to. Lots of things that 20 years ago weren't available to authors. So you published the book. Did you go on a book tour?
Not really.
Okay.
I published the book through McFarland. They're a small press that does a lot of baseball books,
right,
with Sabre authors. So it was kind of a natural fit. And living out here in Washington State, the book certainly has regional appeal to the Midwest. So I did go back and do a couple of book signings in the Midwest. After the book came out, but not a big tour or anything. Nothing like I'm doing currently with my new book.
And so that book, what year did you publish that? Was that 2020?
It was actually just last year.
Last year. Okay. So Now with the Spokane Indians book, were you completely done with the Redbirds book before you started? Okay. So you finished one and that didn't overwhelm and daunt you. So you decided to write a second book. Now, the question I've been wanting to ask you, you're not from here, and that's neither here nor there. And the bus crash is not exactly, I've been aware of the bus crash way off in the corner back of my mind type thing, but it's not something that ever got a lot of press because it happened in many years ago. What led you to picking this topic? How were you introduced to the topic?
Well, I actually stumbled across this while doing one of these Saber bios.
Okay.
I was writing a bio for John Leovich, who's a guy from Portland, Oregon, who got one major league hit happened to be off of Bob Feller.
Oh.
And he played for the Bremerton Blue Jackets in 1946. So I just put in like Bremerton Blue Jackets, Leovich, 1946, and newspapers.com. And headlines of this accident came up.
Okay.
And I had never heard of this. And
well, that makes sense. Okay. So you stumbled into it. I mean, it was, now I would have thought maybe you were at a Saber meeting and one of the members was giving a small presentation about it or, something. But that actually, okay. All right. So, but before we start talking about this, I'd like to talk about the nuts and bolts of publishing a second book. Did you pitch this to a publisher before you started this time, or was it like the first book you completed it and then found the publisher afterwards, or how'd you go about the business of book writing, I guess is the question.
Yeah, it was a similar process to my first book in that I wrote the manuscript before reaching out. I guess I started reaching out as I was finishing. I was probably 90% done.
Okay.
And then started again reaching out to publishers, agents, and the response I got from the Cardinals book was I got a lot of rejection from agents, and a couple of small publishers were interested, and ultimately I got published by McFarland. With this book, I found that there was a much more interest in it. And I ended up signing a contract with Rowman and Littlefield, which is another smaller press that tends to do a lot of nonfiction baseball, and had a couple other offers out there as well.
Okay. So walk me through the process and weave in some of the story. I don't want you to, we want people to read the book. I mean, that's the goal here, is that you get out and read the book. It's a very, I mean, as I told you before we hit record, it's a depressing book because it's about a bus crash where 9 people died, which I always feel like I'm saying this wrong, so I'm going to say it and then you're going to hopefully back me up. This is still the worst accident in sporting history in North America.
American professional sports.
Professional sports. Okay. So 9 people lost their lives during this event. Okay. What was it like to research this and how did you, walk us through that? How'd you go about putting the book together?
Yeah. So initially when you go to the Spokane Indians baseball reference page, it's a list of like 50 names, and there's no indication on there, who was involved in this accident. And even, Google, you have to really, really dig to find out who was involved. And there are a couple players whose stories are pretty well known, but the vast majority of the team, the people involved in the accident, were relatively unknown. So for me, it was, I started by going through and sort of researching each individual, because each was, a professional baseball player. So they had been in the news for years before this, as they were coming up in their careers. And so my first goal was just to find out everything I could about each player, and then also going through that season. A part of the book is also describing, what unfolded that season from spring training through the first 2 months as they played games in the Western International League.
And now, being in 46, right post World War II, a lot of these guys had military service. The economy was kind of, well, and I never really realized this, post World War II. I mean, you and I are much younger than that. I wasn't present. You weren't present. But we think of the explosion of America, of suburbia during the 50s, of, lookalike homes, 2 cars in the driveway, all kind of fueled by that post-war economic engine. But immediately post-war, there was a lot of inflation. The economy was a little wonky. It wasn't the best of times. And baseball, I think baseball's a really good mirror of American society at any given moment, good and bad. It
Yes.
showcases the good and the bad of what's going on in our country. And I'm under the impression that, minor league baseball in 46 was kind of cobbled together. People struggled in some ways of getting talent, just like they did during the World War II years, where, if you were a healthy man, you were you're called off to duty in most cases, unless you had some, ailment. But if you had an ailment that stopped you from going in the military, it probably stopped you from being a good athlete too at the same time. I mean, okay. So these guys are back from World War II. They end up in Spokane. Not all the players, most of them weren't most of the players on the roster kind of California centric?
Yeah, I would say about half the team was from California.
Yeah.
There were a couple from the Midwest and East Coast, but most of them had actually, I think 3 or 4 were from San Francisco.
Okay.
And a lot of them were under contract with Pacific Coast League teams.
Right, which was, the third major league, if you will. And in some cases, I have a good friend whose grandfather pitched semi-pro baseball in the 20s and 30s. And my friend is cataloging all of his grandfather. Don't quote me, 340 wins so far.
Wow.
And he played semi-pro because he got paid more money than he would have playing in the minors and with a shot to go to the bigs. And my friend has dropped names of, Lefty O'Doul, Ty Cobb came to his house supposedly to try to recruit him to go sign with the Tigers, things like that. And this guy stayed in the Bay Area because he got paid a lot of money to throw a baseball. He played my friend and I met online because his grandfather pitched in 1918 for the Aberdeen Black Cats team in Aberdeen, Washington. He took a steamer up and played in Aberdeen because he was paid a lot of money to play in this. And that was in the Pacific International League. It was a competing league. I mean, baseball's always fractured. Leagues are, wealthy men get upset with other wealthy men, so they go start a league of their own type thing, blah, 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 blah. And the Western International League, the Indians was a minor league. They got their players both, though, from all over, but some were Pacific Coast League players, but some were also, wasn't there a couple of Yankee contracts on there, that sent them to Spokane? Okay.
Exactly.
So they kind of cobbled together a roster. Just like the Wenatchee team did in that league, just like Bremerton did in that league. Salem was in that league. And the team was doing pretty well, right? I mean, they weren't in first. Was Wenatchee still in first place at that time?
Salem, I believe, was in first place.
Salem, okay.
When the crash occurred.
So
they were.
Yeah. So the event that was, and is that they were they loaded the bus up in Spokane were they heading to Salem to play, or were they heading to Bremerton? Bremerton. So Snoqualmie Pass in 46 looks radically different than Snoqualmie Pass in 2022.
24. One of the things in the story, and I don't think I'm giving it away. Well, it is, but still, is they stopped in Ellensburg.
Yes.
Okay, I went to college in Ellensburg, so it's like, I get, anytime Ellensburg's in a story, I'm like, piques my curiosity. And they stopped in Ellensburg, and one of the players was contacted. Now, in today's day and age, you think he would have gotten a text or a cell phone call, but how did they get a hold of him in Ellensburg?
So someone from the team notified the state police, and the state police passed the message along to a local police station.
Okay.
And they knew where the team was having dinner. So they tracked the team down at this place called Webster's Cafe, and passed the message along that, hey, you need to report to the San Diego Padres. You're being called up to the Pacific Coast League. So
right.
that player hitchhiked back to Spokane.
So think about what we know about sports today. The fact that the player hitchhiked back to Spokane. The San Diego team didn't pay for him to get to no, kid, you hitchhike back to Spokane. We'll figure out how to get you to San Diego, but you got to hitchhike. Okay.
Yeah.
So Webster's Cafe, it's so funny. I read the book. I read Webster's Cafe. I thought about it lots of times. I was watching some of your talk that you did with the Ellensburg Historical Society, right? Mm-hmm. And you were correct. You were politely corrected by someone in the audience about the building.
Yes.
But I didn't think for the life of me, it didn't click until just now, that Webster's Cafe is where I hung out when I was in college, drinking espressos and having cheesecake. That was our go-to thing in the afternoons. Wow. This was in the early 80s before espresso was really a thing. We just thought we were cool. But Webster's was my favorite place in Ellensburg. I had no clue until just, a minute ago that restaurant is linked to this story.
Wow, that's very cool. All and right. It's still, the building is still there.
The building's still there. It's not Webster's anymore. It's
I think it's like a wine bar now.
Yeah, it's something. Webster's was great. Anyway, so this guy, they track him down, and he's hitchhiking back to Spokane. All right. The bus continues on. There's an accident on Snoqualmie Pass, and the bus is, I don't know. Would we say it's run off the road? I mean, that the way it's written in the book, it's a little unclear. That it's a one car that kind of runs into the bus, and
yeah, a car, according to eyewitness accounts, crossed the center line, and the bus driver, trying to avoid this car, kind of moved to the shoulder of the road, mm-hmm. and it was a gravel road, and had trouble getting the bus back on the road.
Yeah, and so the bus crashes. 9 people are killed. And you spend a lot of the book, because that's the signature event of the book, but it only like a couple of pages, because it's not, you spend the rest of the book talking about how this event impacts people. And that's really powerful, because it seemed like it really dramatically impacted these guys.
Yes. Yeah. Countless lives.
Yeah. And how did you, so they weren't some of them went back to play ball. Some of them were deceased, but where were you able to find the details about their post-accident lives? Because that's not like it's in the local news, is it?
Not at all. So 6 players survived this accident. 5 of them went on to play professionally in some form. Mm-hmm. The 6th player, who was severely injured and nearly died, actually did come back and play semi-pro ball.
Okay.
And in his case, for example, I got in contact with his son.
Okay.
And his son filled me in on what he did after this accident, how the accident affected him and so forth. And that was the case for a number of people involved in the story, is just getting in contact with relatives, descendants who had information about them.
And were the family members supportive of this? Did they want the stories? I mean, did they? Yeah, I mean, you're opening up a wound at some point, but were the families receptive?
Yes, everyone I got in contact with was very supportive of the project and very willing to provide information. Now, there were a few family members who I reached out to and didn't hear back from. So, perhaps in their case, they didn't want to delve into this for whatever reason. But of the 16 players who were on that bus today, I got in contact with 12 of the players' descendants.
Wow. Okay. That's a very good success rate.
And this was, in some cases, nieces, children, grandchildren in a couple of cases. And some of the people knew very little about their relatives. And in other cases, it was they had a treasure trove of information, from scrapbooks to personal stories and so forth.
And were they willing to share the scrapbook collections and things like that with you?
They were. And in some cases, for Vic Pachetti and Bob Patterson, two of the kind of more promising young prospects on the team, they had personal letters that these players had written during the course of their minor league career.
Okay. That
kind of described, what was going through their minds, just on a day-to-day experience. So having their voices in the book, and like Vic Pachetti describes, what movies he was going to on road trips, and describing how he was concerned about paying rent and economic hardships and things like that. I think just kind of provided a little more detail than I would have had otherwise, just looking at newspaper archives and things like that.
Yeah, there was this point where four of them were renting a cabin, and then one of them moved out for whatever reason, and so they ended up moving back into the hotel that they had been staying at, and he was describing that in the letter. And yeah, there's some backstory there that you wouldn't have found in the Spokane Review or the Seattle Post Intelligencer or something like that. That's pretty. Yeah, the book's pretty. I liked how you were weaving in to give kind of the flavor of the season. Now, the copy that I read was that you shared with me was a PDF. It was missing photographs, but I remember reading somewhere you tipped your cap to Dave Eskenazi for providing some imagery, and Dave's the local sporting memorabilia vacuum cleaner. He just sucks up everything that ever comes to market. Grudgingly there sometimes with him, but anyway,
very true.
That man's what a wonderful collection and what a wonderful resource for the Northwest.
No doubt.
But how did you go about obtaining? What were you able to find to add to the words in the book?
Well, that kind of differed amongst the players that were described in the book. There were a couple players who actually three of the players on the story played in the major leagues. So there are, of course, numerous photographs of them throughout their careers. For other players, they were certainly more obscure, and so finding photos of them was a challenge. In the Vic Pachetti's family scrapbook, they actually had photos of nearly every player on the team. So in some cases, those were the only photos I had were from this scrapbook.
Wow.
In other cases, Dave Eskenazi provided some very high quality photographs that he graciously allowed me to use in the book. So, yeah, several different sources of where the photographs came from, but certainly I think helps that imagery helps bring the players to life.
One of the people that you go into great detail with is it Garrity? Is that the right pronunciation of his last name?
Yes.
So he spent a very brief time in the majors, but he was a well-traveled minor league manager. And you kind of share his struggles post bus crash with traveling in buses and airplanes. And so I guess from a speculation standpoint, do you think he would have made a major league manager if he wouldn't have been involved in the bus crash? Do you think his behavior and coping would have, because I kind of, from reading what you shared, my interpretation of it was, he seemed like he became a very heavy drinker. And did that stop him from maybe making that jump from being, because he was extremely successful as a minor league manager in multiple locations with multiple types of teams. He was really good at getting his players to excel.
Yeah.
And am I remembering it right? Henry Aaron held him in extremely high regard.
Yes, called him the greatest manager he ever played for, and perhaps the greatest manager who ever lived, was a direct quote from Hank Aaron.
Yeah, so, Hank Aaron was an okay ball player.
He was okay.
He was okay. I actually watched that game on TV when he hit the home run, and those two guys followed him around, and think about what happened in today's day and age.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, just I didn't really think anything of it. Watching it on TV as a kid, I was just like, oh, a couple guys running around. Didn't freak out, Now it'd be okay. Anyway, in your opinion, do you think Garrity would have gone on to manage in the majors?
I think certainly the accident derailed any chance of that happening. Just from interviewing players who played for him, and also reading Pat Jordan's memoir, A False Spring, which is a very good book, and he vividly describes Garrity and his baseball acumen and how talented of a baseball mind he was. But I interviewed Howie Bedell, who played for Garrity and went on to have a long career in the game as a scouting director. And he specifically told me that had it not been for Ben's alcohol use, that he would have at some point been elevated to a major league manager. And he pointed to this accident as being the source of his alcoholism. So I do think that there was a very good chance that he could have succeeded had it not been for this accident.
Because he had, his minor league managing record was remarkably solid with lots of players. It's one thing to get a kid to hit well at AA, maybe get a guy to hit and field well at AAA, but for them to make the leap, it's sometimes you got to have that extra gear. And he seemed to find that in players. He seemed to help them, and the game was different than it is today. Like I mentioned earlier when we started, John Pregenzer, like I said, he pitched for the San Francisco Giants. He pitched for the Tacoma Giants. In the offseason, he was a school teacher. In the offseason, these guys had full-time jobs. The baseball didn't pay. If you were Henry Aaron or you were, Willie Mays or you were Whitey Ford or Mickey Mantle, you got paid. But a lot of the guys that were on that major league roster or in the AAA rosters, they were working extra jobs, unlike today where the major league rosters, I don't think there's a guy on a team that's probably making less than $700,000 a year.
Exactly.
And maybe it's $1 million now. It's certainly $1 million on average if you just, factor in Shohei Ohtani's numbers to everything, and everybody makes $1 million because of him. But, baseball was very different. It was something you did for a few months of the year, and then you went to your quote unquote regular life, and then you came back to baseball. And Garrity seemed like he was able to, during those months that he had the players, to really get them to perform at a very high level.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, even though, in the minor leagues, his roster would turn over every year. Players are advancing up the system, but no matter what level he managed at, almost every season his team was at the top of the standings. It was uncanny.
And it's from what little additional research I've done, it seemed like he was very well respected. I don't want to say liked, because that might not be the right word, but he was respected by the players that he was in charge of overseeing, and that's
no doubt.
I mean, the praise that Henry Aaron gave on him was, my gosh. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's and that was, one of the greatest baseball players ever. And to have him, and yeah, it's just amazing. And to think that he was tied to Spokane, that's the interest, it's like, you just never, it's just interesting how all these stories weave in and out of things. So when you were doing your research and you were researching for this event, did you come across anything else that you thought was, any other, maybe that didn't get into the book, but maybe were just like interesting anecdotes on the side that you stumbled across?
I think anything interesting probably made it into the book. Gosh.
Well, did you, when you were researching it, did you see anything about Bremerton or Wenatchee or Salem? Did anything else about the 46 season strike an interesting chord with you?
Yeah. Well, the very interesting thing about that season, of course, during the war, thousands of minor league players went off to serve in the military. And now in 46, all these players were coming back and looking to resume their careers. And so in the Pacific Coast League, at spring training that year, the camps were just overflowing with players. At the Oakland Oaks camp, for example, that's where several of the Spokane Indians played. They were managed by Casey Stengel, and they had something like 60 players in camp, and of course had to whittle the roster down to 20-something players by the start of the season. So, I think an interesting component of the 46 season was and this was going on across the game in many leagues and many teams. And so you had all these guys who were, just kind of looking forward to getting their careers back on track. And now they were suddenly competing with, twice as many guys as they were before the war. So, I'm sure, I didn't really dig into other teams in the Western International League unless they were playing the Indians, but there were certainly some interesting stories across the league and across the game that year.
Right. And that's kind of the fun thing about doing research, going back in history, is you're looking for information on the Spokane Indians in a bus crash, but then, a blurb pops up about, insert name of player you played in this league, type, what? Okay. At least I've always found that. So how long was the process for you from deciding you were going to write it to handing the finished manuscript over? When did you lock it down so words weren't going to change? How long did that period of time take you?
I'd say that was close to a year.
Okay.
Maybe just under a year, 10 or 11 months.
Okay. It's interesting. Writers are either, very fast or they're very slow. It's like, that seems very fast to me to put together a book. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of research, a lot of editing. When you write, who do you hand it over to kind of, do the first read, because for me, I'm too close to my work, so I'm not going to catch things. It makes perfect sense to me. Yet if I handed it to you, you'd go, what do you mean this? So how do you do that? How do you work? What's your editing process like?
Yeah. So I, of course, self-edit, probably a dozen times, reading the book, rereading the book, rewriting certain parts. So after doing that for a few months, I handed the manuscript off to a couple of people that I've worked with within Sabre.
Mm-hmm.
One guy, Bill Nowlin, he's written tons of books on the Boston Red Sox and World War II. So I knew he had some expertise in the time, the era that this book took place. So
right,
having his input was very valuable. And then another guy who was incredibly helpful was Jim Price, who he's a retired sports writer from the Spokesman Review in Spokane.
Okay.
And he has written about this accident over the years, especially on anniversaries of the crash.
Mm.
He's gone back and written like the 50-year anniversary story, 60-year anniversary story. So he knows probably as much as anyone out there about this. So having the input of those two guys, kind of fact checking, and then also just providing some editorial guidance was very helpful.
Okay. What's next? Got another book lined up? Are you going to write another book? And if so, have you selected the next topic?
To answer the first question, yes. I've kind of fell in love with the process of writing, researching and writing. There's that. And those are two different things for me. There's the digging into the story and finding out, bits of information that have been maybe forgotten over time or haven't been told or explored fully. And then there's the writing process of bringing that to the page and telling it in a way that's, entertaining and impactful for the reader. So
mm-hmm.
I love the process. So I'm definitely going to write a third book, but I haven't yet quite landed on the topic yet.
It's still baseball. Is that safe to assume it's going to be baseball?
I think so. That's certainly my, it's a good escape from my everyday job in medicine. I wouldn't want to write anything about medicine per se, because that's, baseball is writing is my escape from that.
Escape. So, all right.
Yeah.
I can understand.
And I know more about baseball than certainly other sports. And so that's probably land on some topic within baseball.
Okay. So I warned you about this. And so going back to your Sabre profiles, how did you pick? No, let me rephrase that. Do you pick who you're writing about, or does Sabre assign them to you?
Yes, you pick the player.
Okay.
Although many players have bios already. So it has to be a player who does not have a bio.
Right.
The goal with this project is for every player in history to eventually have a bio.
Okay.
And they're up to like 6,000 of the 20,000 players. So there's 14,000 players out there who don't have bios.
All right. I've never heard of this player before. I was kind of scrolling through the bios of the players that you've written about, and a couple of them popped up. Number one was Alvin Davis, which for anybody that's, a Mariners fan, he's revered. I mean, he's right up there with Edgar and Ken Griffey Jr. and Ichiro and Randy Johnson. And he's right there in that. And even though he was a very good player, but he wasn't a great player. He was not I wish I was half as good of a baseball player as he was, but he wasn't, he was a fan favorite.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that you adopted the Mariners.
Yeah. And actually named my childhood dog Alvin.
Really?
In part because of Alvin Davis, having his baseball card and being a fan from afar.
That's funny. Okay. Cuddles Marshall. Now, the reason I'm bringing Cuddles up is twofold. Number one, it's a hysterical nickname, but the guy was from Bellingham. So he's a Washington State guy. So it's perfectly appropriate for this podcast to talk about Cuddles Marshall. Why did you pick him? How did you find out about him? Mm-hmm. Give us a super quick high level overview of Cuddles. Really, his name is Clarence Marshall, but he was called Cuddles. How did you land on Cuddles Marshall?
Well, having lived in Washington State now for about 10 years, I've definitely grown a connection to the region. And just like I, started writing stories about these guys I grew up watching in St. Louis, mm-hmm. I started digging into guys from Washington State. And on Baseball Reference, you can, one of the search tools they have is you can go and see every player who was born in Washington State who's ever played.
So I'm going to interrupt you. Mm-hmm. you. Last time you looked at that, how many players was that?
I think it's about 200.
It's not that many.
Not that many, yeah, especially compared to
not
California.
That many. Right. Okay. All right. Sorry. All right. A couple hundred players from Washington State. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so, that's, anytime I choose a subject to write about, I have to have some interest or connection. So whether it's, my hometown team, Mariners player, or in some cases, players from Washington State, okay. Part of it for me is when I'm researching is, I'm looking back at, in the case of Cuddles Marshall, baseball in Bellingham in the 1940s. So mm-hmm. for me, that's kind of just fun and interesting to research. So that's why I chose Cuddles. First of all, looking at that list, of course, his name is going to stand out amongst the other players from Washington State. And then he, pitched for the Yankees. So pretty interesting subject.
Yeah, it was a very interesting bio to read. But then the other thing is I'm reading here. So there was only two. So Bellingham at this point has sent 3 players to the majors at this point in time. So it's not exactly a baseball hotbed, even though it's been a very good baseball town for years, supporting the local player. The Bellingham Bells in the West Coast League now. They've been the Bells before that. I didn't realize even Clarence's bio mentions the Bells. Mm-hmm. in it. So, all right. So when you're not researching and writing about baseball, when you're not working the day job, what do you like to do for fun and excitement?
My wife and I love to travel, and we love hiking. So getting outdoors and exploring Washington State, traveling abroad, mm-hmm. That's kind of why we work and what we save our money for.
Okay. So I'm going to guess that your careers brought you to Washington from the Midwest.
Yes.
Okay. And it's adopted home now. You like living in Washington?
Or do you love it out here.
Or do you miss the humidity and in the
Not in the least. And in fact, my wife and I will only travel back to St. Louis basically like April, May, or September, October, because we don't like the humidity and we don't like the bitter cold. So,
first time I ever got off the airplane in Cincinnati and left the airport, I felt like somebody punched me in the stomach and threw a wet, hot blanket over me. I was not, I was not prepared. Okay.
I'm familiar with that feeling.
Yes. It's, why do you live here? Beautiful area. Don't get me wrong, but I'm spoiled. Questions I ask everybody is, and I prepped you for this, coffee. Mm-hmm. I drink coffee 25 hours a day. I love coffee. I love finding out about coffee shops. Putting you on the spot, even though the question's coming, but where's a great place to get coffee? Where do you recommend?
Yeah, so I'll go a couple different directions with this. Here in Seattle, Fonte down on First Avenue, and Storyville. Those are 2 of my favorites.
I'm not familiar with Storyville, so that's good. Okay, Fonte's super solid, but Storyville, not familiar. Okay.
Yeah. They have 2 locations. One in Pike Place, and the other just a little bit south on First Avenue.
Okay. All right.
And my wife and I are actually moving to Port Townsend this summer.
Okay.
So we've been over there quite a bit lately, and I have a couple favorites that I've quickly adopted over there as well. Velocity,
Okay.
and Better Living Through Coffee. Those are my go-tos in Port Townsend.
With a name like Better Living Through Coffee, you gotta,
Exactly.
what,
It's right on the water. So
yeah.
on a drizzly morning when it's like 50 degrees, getting a vanilla oat milk latte from there.
Is that your go-to coffee beverage?
Yep, 12-ounce vanilla oat milk latte
Does your
every
wife
time.
drink coffee?
Yep, 8-ounce Americano.
See, I'm kudos to her. That's the way to go. I mean, I like Americanos. I drink espresso straight. I like well brewed drip coffee. Nothing wrong with a latte. There's not, but I gravitate towards the simpler things. Okay. So I'm going to ask you this question now, but I'm going to put you on the spot for both Seattle area and Vancouver, not Vancouver, Port Townsend. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get to either of those places around lunchtime. I'm going to want to eat. Where should I go? What should I try?
I'll start with Port Townsend. Tommy Knockers. It's on Water Street.
Yeah.
They have it's kind of like a Scottish food there. I should preface this by saying my wife and I are also vegan, so
okay.
That factors into what restaurants we
Sure.
choose. So they have a separate vegan menu there.
Okay.
With a ton of options. So love that place.
Okay. What about in Seattle?
Seattle, I'm going to go with Peloton.
The company that sells the exercise equipment?
So it's spelled the same way.
Okay.
But it's a bicycle shop on one side and a cafe on the other.
Really?
Yeah. It's at I want to say like 15th and Jefferson.
Huh. Okay. Never thought bike shop and cafe would be in the same breath. But and Peloton throws me as a name because I'm thinking instantly the exercise equipment. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So I warned you there was a third question which I wouldn't share with you, and this is the most important question, and you have a lot of pressure now.
Okay.
You have to answer it, and you have to give your reason why. That's setting the ground rules. Are you ready?
Let's
Cake or pie, and why?
Ooh, I definitely like both, but if I had to choose,
yeah, you have to for this. Yes, you have to.
I would go cake.
Cake, okay. And what type of cake?
A good chocolate cake is hard to beat.
Good chocolate cake. Okay, and why? Why are you picking cake over pie? There's no wrong answers here. It's just, we have to.
Yeah, I do enjoy a good pie now and then, but it seems to me there's half of pie is just like crust, and if you have a good piece of pie with a lot of fruit filling, then that's one thing. But sometimes you get a piece and it's like it's more crust than anything. I just feel like I'm eating a ton of carbs without getting that that sort of sweet fix that I'm looking for, like with a good piece of chocolate cake.
Okay, solid. There's no judgment, no wrong answer, no right answer. I mean, it's funny to watch the expression on people's faces. Sometimes it's super easy for them. They're like camp cake or camp pie, and they will die on that hill. Just like being a Cubs fan and a Cardinals fan, you won't convert them. Other people like you are like, oh, good, and then some people are like, I'd rather give up one of my children. That's an easier choice. You can have little Timmy. Take him. Anyway, it's always fun to watch and listen to the people on a very silly question. What didn't we talk about that we should have?
Wow. Well, as far as the book goes, there are a lot of layers to the story, and that was one of the fun things about writing the book for me. Is I think that it's a book about a team that was involved in a bus crash, but it's so much more than that. There's stories within the story, and a lot of connections to names people will know about. So there's like Vic Pachetti participated in this All-American game with guys like Richie Ashburn, and played with for Mel Ott and Carl Hubble and Connie Mack, and met Babe Ruth. So, it's a story about a minor league team that might seem somewhat obscure to readers at first glance, but there are a lot of connections to names the reader will know about, and by the end of the book, hopefully that these players will feel familiar as well. And that was ultimately my goal of writing the book, was to bring the stories of these kind of forgotten players to life and kind of honor their memory. So
yeah, and you did an excellent job. Like I said, it's not a happy story. It's a story that at its core is about a tragedy. But I really like the way that you focused in on some of the players. I really found, the Ben Garrity, I don't want to say character, but he seemed like a very tortured human being, and you brought that, the way you chose to write your words to me, you kind of showed the tortured nature of his life without making, like, I didn't feel sorry for him. I don't mean it like, it's just, I felt like he would have been more, as I think I'm of the opinion, I think he would have been a major league manager had he not drank so much.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel sorry for him though. And I didn't feel that I just like the way you walked a line there, and you presented information without coloring it one way or the other. So I think that's very difficult to do. And so I appreciate that about the book.
Yeah, thank you. That's kind of you to say that. And that certainly was my goal. And, ultimately, everything I describe about him comes from my sources, interviews with people who knew him, articles written about him at the time.
Yeah. And so I'm, if you're listening, to this and you're thinking about getting the book, I'm going to encourage everyone to grab the book, because it is actually, I think, a very, it's pertinent to Washington State, which is what this show is all about. It's baseball, which is near and dear to me. So there's, 2 thumbs up, but you did an excellent job. You just did an excellent, and I don't want to talk about in great detail about the book, because I want people to read it. I want them to go, not go, oh, I already knew this. And, I want them to read it. And I look forward to you putting together another baseball book. So I'll throw my 2 cents in, you should write another book about baseball. So there, and then where's a good place for people to find out more about you? Where's a good place for them to get a copy of the book? Yeah, let's go ahead and please pitch all of that. See how I worked it in? Pitched.
Very clever.
Yeah.
I do have a website. It's just my name, Eric Vickery, VICKREY.com.
Okay.
So there's links to some of the Sabre articles I've done there, and information about both of the books I've written. My book is published through Rowman and Littlefield, and their website is Rowman, ROWMAN.com. And you can find the book anywhere you can buy books online, as well as select bookstores here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly Seattle and Spokane areas. In Spokane, it's available at Auntie's. I did a signing there. And here in Seattle, Paper Boat Books in West Seattle, Island Books on Mercer Island, and Kingfisher Books in Coopville, Whidbey Island.
So one question I didn't ask you, I'm going to go, because I completely forgot about it, and you just said something, it jogged my brain. I got to ask you this question. I love to ask authors this question. I want you to go back. What did you feel when you saw your book in the wild for the first time at a bookstore? What was that like for you?
Yeah, that's a really cool feeling. That's hard to describe. Because of course I had seen the book. I'd gotten copies mailed to my home.
Right.
That's one thing. That in itself is
that's
very
exciting.
exciting.
Yeah.
but to see it in a bookstore next to people I admire and respect, that's like a very surreal experience, and I don't think it's one I'll ever take for granted
or get tired of walking into a bookstore and seeing your book on the. Would you? I'm kind of kidding, but would you, if you walked into, Third Place Books in Seattle, let's say you walked in there, or Elliott Bay Books in downtown, your book's on the shelf, would you open it up and sign it and put it back?
I have done that.
Okay. I think I would.
Yeah.
If I was an author, I think I'd absolutely do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, well, I'll put links to your website and your publisher in the show notes. I'll put links to your Saber profile in because that's public, so they don't have to be a member to get behind that. And right. I wish you all the best. I'm glad you sat down and talked with me today. And I
enjoyed the conversation.
I hope you do another. I hope you do another baseball book.
I will. I hope to find a topic I can dig into and enjoy exploring as much as this one. That's always the key, is landing on that topic that you're going to spend a lot of time and energy on.
Right. Okay. Hope you enjoyed the show. You can reach me on Twitter at ExploreWaState. I'd love to hear your comments. You can also visit our website at explorewashingtonstate.com. If you know anyone who would like the show, it'd be amazing if you'd share the show with them. This is the biggest way that we grow this show. Good old word of mouth. Glad you were here with me today, and I hope to have you listening to the next episode. See you then.